Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler, and this is your video lesson of the day. Today we're going to be talking about the Stamp Act. And today's first vocabulary word is boycott. And a boycott is to refuse to buy or use. 8th grade definition. To stop buying stuff because you are mad at the seller. And the significance: boycotts can force change. The colonists got mad at the Stamp Act and they started boycotting British goods, and it cost the British merchants so much money that they begged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. So boycotts can force change. Our second word is effigy. Now, an effigy is a life-size rag figure representing a hated person. In this case, it's a tax collector. It's a life-size doll of a hated person. And the colonists sometimes burned effigies of British soldiers or tax collectors. They would make a life-size doll of a tax collector, as you can see in the picture, and they would put a rope around its neck hanging from a tree and sometimes beat it with clubs and sometimes burn it. But it was symbolism that they did not like the taxes or the people who collected them. And our third word is repeal, which means to cancel. The 8th grade, to cancel a law. All these tax acts were tax laws, and the colonists hated them mainly because they didn't have representation in Parliament and they wanted them all canceled. So many of the tax acts passed by Parliament were repealed, and mostly because of the boycotts and the protests from the colonists. All right, the Stamp Act. In 1765, Parliament passed another law to try to raise money, and it was called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act taxed all printed materials in the colonies, like newspapers, pamphlets, wills, playing cards, anything made of paper. And what it had to have is they came up with these stamps, like this one, and this one, and this one, which had to be stamped onto the paper. And if you didn't have the stamp, that means you didn't pay the tax. So it was really smart for the British government to do this because everybody in the colonies used paper. So it affected almost everyone in the colonial cities, and it convinced the colonists that something needed to be done. This Stamp Act made the colonists so mad because there was no way they could avoid using paper. So they couldn't stand it. Well, opposition of the Stamp Act centered on 2 points. And the first was Parliament taxed the colonies directly. Now, the colonies had been colonies for over 150 years. They came in the early 1600s, and they had basically been governing themselves the whole time. The king and the Parliament were too far away to govern the colonies, so they gave them the authority to govern themselves, and they created their own legislatures and they made their own laws. Parliament, when they wanted them to make a law, they would say to the colonial legislatures, make your own law, and then they would talk about it and they would create the law that Parliament told them to. But with these tax acts, they ignored the colonial tradition of self-government, and they were just making the laws right from Parliament for the colonists, and they couldn't stand that. 2, Parliament taxed the colonies without their consent. They didn't have representation, they didn't have a voice, and they didn't have a say. So the colonists were upset by the tax acts, such as the Stamp Act and Sugar Acts, because everyday items were taxed, and they had no say or voice in the taxes. They had nobody in Parliament to represent them. So they began protesting the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry, famous for his speeches, persuaded the Burgesses, or the Virginia legislature, to take action. He basically made a speech in the legislature that sounded something like this. We cannot let the British government tax us like this. This is ridiculous. We have no representation, and now they passed a Stamp Act that they think we can't get around. Well, we're not going to put up with this. Well, people thought that his speech bordered on treason, and he didn't care. He said, well, if this be treason, make the most of it. If he was going to be accused of treason, then he was going to do something about these unlawful tax laws that they were imposing on the colonists. To give you a heads up, Patrick Henry was the guy that says, give me liberty or give me death. He was a pretty famous guy in colonial history. So the Virginia Assembly passed a resolution or a law declaring the Virginia, had the only right and power to tax its citizens. So basically, only Virginia could tax their citizens, or only Virginia could tax Virginians. So they went to the streets and they started protesting. In Boston, Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams, the future president, started the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a secret organization formed to protect the rights of citizens. They were basically a bunch of guys that got together, and when the British government did something to violate their liberties, they had a meeting and they figured out ways to try to solve the problem. So those guys took to the streets to protest the Stamp Act. People in other cities heard what Samuel Adams was doing, and they started forming their own Sons of Liberty. So they started copying each other. This was kind of the first time that the colonies showed a little bit of unity. They were doing the same things in other cities. So in the summer of 1765, protesters hung and beat effigies of tax collectors. Imagine if you were one of the tax collectors walking by and there was a big crowd around you beating a doll of you. What would you do? I'd probably run away. So the other thing that happened was they also raided and destroyed houses belonging to royal officials. And one of these houses that they raided and destroyed was the royal governor of Massachusetts. So he would not forget this, and a few years down the road, he would make them remember. So they marched down the street shouting, "Only Americans have the right to tax Americans." So the Stamp Act Congress. Now Congress, as you were taught, the Congress makes the laws for the United States and Parliament makes the laws for Britain. But the word Congress actually means meeting. So Stamp Act meeting, they're going to discuss the Stamp Act in ways that they can take care of this problem. So delegates or representatives from 9 colonies met in New York. Here's a picture of the Stamp Act Congress. So they wrote a petition or a letter to the King and Parliament declaring that the colonies could not be taxed except by their own assemblies. Basically, only Americans can tax Americans. So they decided that they would not use the stamps, so they destroyed them. And they imposed boycotts on British and European goods. Now what happened was they used non-importation agreements to get people to boycott. Now basically what a non-importation agreement is, it's a piece of paper, and up in this portion it talks about what you will not do. You will not use British goods. I will not buy British tea. I will not buy British whatever. And then they all sign their name to it. So thousands of people signed these, and they pledged not to buy or use British goods. Now, the boycotts worked because British merchants lost so much business. They begged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And then this cartoon, "Please buy my British goods, I'm going out of business." So, in 1766, I think around March, Parliament listens to the merchants and they repeal the Stamp Act. But at the same time, Parliament, the Stamp Act has been repealed. Only Americans can tax Americans. So the Americans are feeling pretty good about themselves. The boycotts worked. But at the same time they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed another law called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act basically said that we can tax you anytime we want. It said that Parliament has the right to tax and make decisions for the British colonies in all cases. So we can tax you now. So then they came up with some new taxes. Now these taxes were called the Townsend Acts. And the Townsend Acts were external taxes. Since the colonists would not tolerate internal taxes, those paid inside the colonies, the tax would be paid on the imported goods when they got to the port and before they entered the colony. So, for example, to explain what an internal tax is, if you went to the store and bought a pencil and the pencil had a price tag of 25 cents, when you go to the cash register, you have to pay 28 cents because you have to pay the tax, whatever it is. Well, the colonists wouldn't pay that tax. So what they did was, when they dropped a shipload of pencils off, whoever unloaded the pencils had to pay the tax for all the pencils. And when the pencils went to the store, instead of charging 25 cents, they charged 28 cents. And when they went to the cash register, they only paid 28 cents because the tax had already been paid. Now, they taxed items like glass, tea, paper, and lead, all items which were not produced in the colonies. These Townsend Acts, or these external taxes, did not fool the colonists, and they still refused to pay them. You're not fooling us. We won't accept external taxes either. So they boycotted again, and this time the boycotts worked even better because they were good at it by this point. So they boycotted the tax. They boycotted tea, they boycotted glass, they boycotted anything that was taxed by the Townsend Acts. And eventually they repealed all the Townsend Acts except one, and that was the tax on tea. So women helped out the cause by forming the Daughters of Liberty. And they basically wore homemade fabrics and started to produce goods that were only available from Britain. So they would take cotton and make thread out of it and turn the thread into material, make clothes out of the material. They would make things like soap and other things that before they could only get in Britain, they started making them in the colonies. The Daughters of Liberty's goal was to be economically independent of Britain. That's your video lesson of the day, kids. So get your note taker done and your evidence questions. Thanks and have a good day.